I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing the United States of America, and in particular, its president, Donald J. Trump, which, of course, therefore means we're talking about the whole world, because the reach of the President of the United States is indeed truly global. I'm joined by an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. Now, Donald Trump is in deep doo-doo. I know you thought he already was. Maybe you thought he had just climbed out of the swamp that he'd promised to drain, gotten free of Russiagate, Robert Mueller, and all the dogs of war that were yapping and barking and biting at his heels, but he's back in the swamp again. If you thought Russiagate was absolute lunacy, wait till you hear about the Ukraine gate. They have managed to simultaneously, in parallel, overlapping, accuse Donald Trump first of being a tool of Russia and at the same time a tool of Russia's worst enemy in the world, which is Ukraine. The proximate cause of the row is Donald Trump asking the new president of Ukraine, who used to be a comedian, make of that what you will. That must have been quite a phone call. Might have been a laugh a minute. But in it, President Trump asked the new president of Ukraine to properly investigate allegations that the previous US administration of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and yes, Joe Biden had been up to their neck in corruption and malfeasance in Ukraine. Now, maybe I'm missing something, but it seems to me that the corruption, malfeasance, and crimes, misdemeanors that might have been carried out by a previous American administration was rather more important than a row about the current president of the United States asking that it should be investigated. After all, what should Donald Trump have said? Yes, there's a suggestion that many millions of dollars were corruptly made by people associated with my predecessor administration, but I don't want you to investigate that. Just think about that for a minute and you'll, I'm sure, come to the same conclusion as me. But of course, it's not just the Joe Biden, Hunter Biden affair, though it's worth spending a moment on that. Joe Biden was the Vice President of the United States, living in the White House itself. His son, Hunter Biden, was dismissed by the United States military for sniffing crack cocaine. And in the twitch of a nostril, after his discharge, he ended up on the board of a very prominent Ukrainian oil and gas company on $50,000 a month. He knew nothing about oil or gas. Far as I know, knew nothing about Ukraine. So what was it that this oil and gas company first saw in Hunter Biden? Could it be connected to the fact that his father was the Vice President of the United States? Barack Obama's children were too young, I think, to put on to the board of a Ukrainian oil and gas company, but Hunter Biden was free. having been sacked from the US military for sniffing crack cocaine. So they gave him the job, they gave him the money. And Joe Biden subsequently made more visits to the Ukraine than he did to anywhere else in the entire world. Now, Ukraine's a beautiful place, Kiev, a beautiful city, but I don't think he was there for the dancing girls or the chicken Kiev. I think he was there because of the filthy lucre, and not just $50,000 a month either. And of course, the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, were up to their necks in other kinds of corruption, much deadlier kinds than that. The Obama administration coordinated, fueled, I would argue, partially carried out the so-called revolution in Ukraine that overthrew the president, set the parliament on fire, forced members of parliament at gunpoint to sign a whole series of laws, one of which was to reduce the Russian language spoken by nearly 40% of the population of Ukraine to a second-class language, no longer an official language. So, if you ask me, Donald Trump actually has a duty to ask the president of Ukraine to investigate these matters, and that's what he did. And the Democrats have pressed the panic button. Now, that's been overtaken, in a way, by events in Syria. You know, I've said to you before how the world has turned upside down, how left now is right and right is now left and right mean nothing at all. The left in the United States is denouncing Donald Trump for withdrawing American forces from a foreign country. He's being denounced from the left for ending an American war. Go figure. This is Alice in Wonderland. It's Alice through the looking glass. The right in America is saying no more Middle East wars. And the left in America is saying more Middle East wars. I sometimes wonder if I'm dreaming all of this. And yet, it's real enough. And both issues, Ukraine and Syria, the Kurdish question, are now moving like a pincer against Donald Trump. It's unlikely that they will succeed in impeaching him, though you never know. You never know if Article 25 might be triggered, declaring Trump to be mentally unfit to continue as President of the United States. And if he doesn't take that phone away, that Twitter account, if his wife doesn't confiscate his phone, he might well actually end up like that. His late night tweets certainly are evidence of madness quite often. But if they don't impeach him, if they don't remove him, they fear that he's going to win a second term as President of the United States. Not least because the Democrats seem absolutely determined to nominate for the second time the only person in the United States who could lose an election to Donald Trump. In this case, the father of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, whose teeth flew out in a presidential debate on television the other day. Blood coming from his eyes on television in a presidential debate. Who, if he stands any longer under these TV lights, is going to melt because his face seems to me to be made of plastic. These are some of the issues that we face in a discussion about the impeachment of Donald Trump. Let me turn to some of my experts. Who's got the microphone? Well, this expert is a real expert. He's a United States citizen, a journalist working in England, a champion of Julian Assange. It's a pleasure to welcome you here, Patrick Henningsen.
Thanks, George. So on this subject of impeachment, I think what we can conclude here is that there's a trend happening both in the U.S. and in the U.K. too, maybe in Brazil we can include in this conversation, the total politicization of all aspects of government, every agency, the judiciary, the intelligence community. And so what happens when you have this sort of culture in politics? It's extremely dangerous. You could have a complete breakdown of the forms of government that we've been used to seeing in the last so many decades. And I think that's what's happening. Look at Brexit. The judiciary is involved in deeming the prorogation of Parliament as unlawful. Politicians are being asked to hand over their instant messages, to have them scrutinized to see if what they were doing had a political motivations. Well, of course they've had political motivations because this is what politicians do, but this is what's happening in America as well, complete politicization of all aspects of government, lawfare writ large, the sort of thing that put Lulu in prison, arguably, ahead of the last election
in Brazil.
In Brazil. But what all this is doing is going to promulgate populism even more, because the more the average voter sees this drift of the establishment away from the people, this is how it's going to be translated. In the case of Donald Trump, absolutely, this is how it's going to be translated by his base. This will energize his base even more than they were in 2016. And so it's going to have the opposite effect, I think. I think the establishment is in a death spiral at the moment, and they really don't know how to get out because they're so deeply invested in all these different gates. And America is having gate fatigue.
Russia gate, Ukraine gate, tax gate.
Gate fatigue is setting in the United States. So that means that no matter how far they push this impeachment scenario, it won't have the sort of effect that Lewinsky Gate had in 1998 or that Watergate had in 1994. It's just not going to be the same. The hand has been played so many times now in the last couple of years with Mueller, the Mueller probe and so forth. So the law of diminishing returns has absolutely set in. And again, that defers to populist laws of political physics at that point. So that's
very interesting.
That's what I think.
Thanks for kicking us off with that. Andre Walker, you are a conservative commentator of note, radio broadcaster, writer. How does it look to you from your side of the fence?
Well, look, I think what you've just heard is extremely important. We're seeing right across the Western world this, quangos taking over huge swathes of government. So governments are no longer democratic. And of course, what they do is they constantly attack people who are democratically elected. I thought there was a brilliant example, actually, in the UK of 21-year-old Darren Grimes, who campaigns to leave the European Union as a fashion student from the University of Brighton. And the Electoral Commission has hounded this guy. Now we see with Rudolph Giuliani, somebody who was quite obviously representing the President of the United States of America is now being investigated by his own agency, the Southern New York Law Center, the Office of the US Attorney. I'm extremely concerned about this whole thing, simply because the idea that you can elect somebody, and whoever you elect, there is a criminalization of politics.
Criminalization, that's a good word.
It's absolutely right. And the crazy thing, of course, here is this. What the Democrats are saying. Now, one of the things that worried me, I worked for Breitbart, so I got involved in journalism when the Mercer family introduced me to Steve Bannon. So nobody could be more kind of on this page than I am. But one of the things that really worries me is the way that, or amazes me, is the way that in America and in Britain, there is a political class who have enriched themselves. You know, you look at somebody like Bill Clinton and Hillary, you know, you're not talking about making $1 million when you leave office. You're talking about making 100 million, 200 million. Where does this money come from? In the case of Joe Biden, talk about shooting the messenger, by the way. In the case of Joe Biden, the Democrats are now putting about that Joe Biden was so angry with the Ukrainian prosecutor dropping the investigation into his son. That's why he called for him to be sacked. Now, anybody with any degree of sanity can tell you that that is complete and total nonsense. But fundamentally, what we're watching here is this: an attempt across the world, whether it be Brexit in the UK, whether it be Donald Trump in America, to drain the swamp, to remove the professional political class, and we are seeing them fighting back, and they are fighting dirty. And I have to say, they are destroying, in my view, the political institutions, both in Britain and America, and it's very worrying.
Can I tell you which country in the world gave most money to the Clinton Foundation?
I believe it's Saudi Arabia.
It was a good guess. Qatar might have been a good second guess. UAE a third guess, but it was none of them. It was Ukraine. Adam, Garrie, considerable intellectual commentator. How does this all look to you?
Well, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh, because it really is commedia dell'arte. You were talking about the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, who was a former comedian. And I have to say, especially with politics these days, there's really only two classes of politicians: failed comedians and aspiring messianic cult leaders. And so please don't follow me, brothers and sisters. There's a tragic element to this tragic comedy, because as we've heard before, it's weakening democracy. It's weakening institutions that used to help democracy in terms of providing them a foundation, but which have been politicized for all the reasons that we just heard. But when it comes to the people who, one way or another, are the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner of their own will, it's going to make Donald Trump look huge, and or huge, I suppose I should say. But this is one element that I think we can look
Bigly.
at. Well, it's going to be bigly. You've never seen anything like it. One thing that Trump reminds me of is he reminds me of a Democrat from the first half of the 20th century into the latter part of the 19th century. When we look at how the parties in America operated until sort of the 1960s, 70s, the Democrats had two main wings. There was the brute force, rock'em sock'em East Coast wing, the Tammany Hall wing, the people who would dig up dirt, and if they couldn't find any, they'd
plant it.
Indeed. And then there were the Southern Democrats who were sort of living in the post-Civil War afterglow with all of their quite nasty policies and the rest of it. The Republican Party, though, was neither of those things. It was a combination of East Coast men who liked to play polo, Midwestern men who ran medium-sized honest businesses and all the rest of that. And then there were the cowboys from the West who, the minute they arrived in New York or Washington, would learn how to play polo, and they'd trade the Stetson in for a cravat. Donald Trump is a Tammany Hall Democrat. For him, the worse, the better. He loves it when he's up against the ropes, because that gives him an opportunity to punch his opponent all the way to the other side of the ring. So by these people, who are quite Lilliputian when you compare them to some of the opponents that people like Nixon, for example, faced, Trump must be really happy, angry, but a happy sort of angry, because this is exactly where he wants to be. The danger for Trump is that his base would become complacent, and that, more worryingly for him, they would see Trump as becoming one who surrendered to the swamp. They can't say that now, because in fighting for his political life, he's also fighting on behalf of his base. It's the biggest I told you so moment in politics, and he must be absolutely relishing it.
Ma'am, you're also a United States citizen, an activist here in England. Looking across the pond, how do you see things?
Carol Gould, I'm a broadcaster and author. I'd like to talk about at the coalface, because in the past 48 hours, President Trump has attended several enormous rallies.
I saw the Minnesota one.
Minnesota,
Atlantic, yeah.
Louisiana. His base, as we like to describe it, couldn't care less about Fruman and Parnas, the Ukrainian and the Belarus gentlemen who have been arrested at Dulles Airport. Again, another thread in the Ukrainian story. What I find interesting about these rallies is that the base is enormous. And as we've all said just now, and I am not a Trump supporter.
Nor
I'm
I.
in from the outside.
Nor I.
And in 2016, I'm supposed to be an impartial journalist, but I was a huge supporter of Bernie Sanders. But let's look at 2020 and now. A year is a long time in politics, as the cliche goes. But if you look at these rallies, you will see that his base couldn't care less about Hunter Biden. They wouldn't even know who Parnas and Fruman are. Some of them are a little bit upset that Shepard Smith, the host on Fox News, had to leave his job yesterday, Friday. because Attorney General Barr had lunch with Rupert Murdoch the day before. And President Trump, as you say, in one of his 3 a.m. crazy tweets, became hysterical because Fox News happened to show a poll that showed that he was behind. And as you say, Melania ought to take his phone away from him and his toys. But in a year's time, I would say, and when I prepared to do this program, I was told, how do you think the impeachment, quote unquote, will affect the poll? Trump is Teflon man, like Bill Clinton. After the Lewinsky affair, those of us who remember it vividly, remember that he could have run for a third term, despite being what I call partially impeached. Because, as Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. If you look at Illinois right now, the industries are booming. Several states that were as even the filmmaker, Michael Moore, who is very much on the left, admitted in 2016, the blue-collar people are voting for Trump, but also many Democrats, because they had a house, a car, and a job 10 years before, and they had 8 years of Obama, and they're saying, what happened? So they voted Trump. And if the economy is as booming now as it is in 2020, Trump could have another term. He is worried, and the Republicans are worried right now about the gubernatorial elections coming up November 5th, George. Louisiana is Democrat. The Republicans are hoping to overthrow the governor. But Kentucky and Mississippi are possible moves to Democrats. So they have to work very hard on those. But let's not forget that in 2016, Trump won a number of states that Obama had won in 2012. And I would not be surprised, and I am being devil's advocate here, that in 2020, if this Ukraine thing blows over, which I suspect it will, even if Congress votes to impeach him, the Senate will not. I'll eat my hat. I've got my hat over there.
I'll eat mine too.
Yeah,
We'll have a lunch together.
Yeah, absolutely. With some ketchup on top, Heinz. Ooh, God, should I have said that? Anyway.
Other ketchups are available.
There are, yeah. But if this blows over, and he is Teflon man, as I believe he is, like Clinton, you know, we're all talking about big business, big money, deep state, all sorts of conspiratorial ideas, but at the coalface, his base still, they love him.
Like you, I'm a Sanders supporter. Do you think Sanders' chances are blown by the health turn that he's taken? Seems to me likely.
I think it's likely. The world would be a different place had he won in 2016. He won 2,000 delegates, 22 states, and he won the international, the vote that we vote in, overseas Americans, overseas Democrats. He won it by a landslide against Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And some nasty things went on at the Philadelphia Convention. The world would be a different place, but now I think he is vulnerable because of his health.
I agree. Much more of this coming up after the break. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing the United States of America and its President, Donald J. Trump, most particularly. Earlier, we took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
If Donald Trump is impeached, what do you think the impact might be on U.S. politics?
I think by and large, it'll prove that the procedures or policies that we have in place actually work. Trump should have been impeached multiple years ago by now, probably the day after he became president.
In my opinion, is going to be best for the whole world. And I think the kind of politics Trump plays is detrimental for the development of world order.
It can't be a good thing for any leader to be impeached. Lack of confidence. From what I know, though, from people who I know in America, he's got, he's really well supported over there. So, I don't think it'd be a good thing at all all round for anybody.
If he's impeached, the vice president will get, the power. So, I mean, the domestic, it will have for sure an impact on the next year election, but still the guidelines of the domestic policy will be almost the same.
I don't even know. I mean, I don't think it's so clear cut, really. It'll set off some sort of chain reaction somehow. I mean, on the face of it, it sounds like it's a great thing, but then what does that mean if Donald Trump's not in power? You've got Mike Pence. Is he any better?
Donald Trump is not a good leader for the people because he's authoritarian and absolute leader, and this behavior is not a good behavior to democracy and to people.
How do you think it might affect some of the decisions that he's already taken, for example, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, Syria, and the North Korean peace talks?
So while he's made those decisions, I don't think that he's actually withdrawn any troops as of yet. So we fall into that whole Trump-Obama era, sort of where Trump spent the first year and a half just undoing everything Obama did. The next president can sort of spend a little bit of time sort of undoing exactly what Trump did.
It will not change the positions already taken.
It's very, very dangerous for life on Earth.
I don't trust his government enough. So, in my opinion, a different government would make more certain decisions on that area.
Well, the peace talks with North Korea have gone pretty well. He's done more for the peace of North Korea and that area than any other president has done, in recent living history. So I'm not really sure about that. But as far as pulling troops out of war zones like Afghanistan and things like that, it'll be really left up to whoever takes charge if he does get removed from office to make them decisions, won't it?
Well, mixed views on the streets of London. I quite like the Londoner there myself. One of the things that stood out for me in those contributions was the phrase chain reaction, that the impeachment of Trump would undoubtedly create a chain reaction. And I don't mean that in a good way. Trump has the support of at least 40% of the American public, and almost all of them have got guns. Winston, how does it look to you, sir?
Winston Hall, historian and political interested party. I think that it's disturbing that since the mid-90s there has been a demonization of politicians, a polarization between the right and the left. Even though those terms don't seem to make as much impact as they used to, there has still been the idea of we're right, you're wrong, left or right. And people are, if you're not on our side, we're automatically an enemy. What seems to be lost in this is that right or left, people are still part of the same country. Taking the president and putting him in front of an impeachment proceedings, which has been started, is disturbing in the sense that the president is still now having to deal with the problems of a possible impeachment procedure and to manage the country and to deal, of course, with the rest of the world. It shows a potential instability, which is always disturbing. Nobody likes instability. The world carries on fairly happily. There are problems, as always, but you like the idea that there's still a steadying hand. When you introduce instability, it has the same effect as putting your finger on an LP that's going around. Something goes wrong, discs get scratched, and the world starts to go a bit off kilter. If the president is seen to be focusing more on a potential impeachment and having to defend himself, that leaves less attention for the rest of the domestic economy, for the world economy, and for world stability. That encourages other parties who have disturbing agendas to try and influence their own sections of the world. If they feel that the cat's away looking at something else, the mouse will play. It causes further instability around the world, and disturbing situation for the United States, which then has to be sorted out later. I think personally that the demonizing of President Trump, as we saw here, some of the people asked, automatically said, I don't like his politics, I think he should be impeached. The fact that one doesn't like one's politics in a democracy, it's part of a healthy democracy. You don't have to like everybody else. You can disagree with them, but you can still say they're okay.
Or you could say, I can't wait till the next election.
I can't wait till the next election. But to say, I think he should be impeached because I, for example, don't like his politics, that's a ridiculous statement as far as I'm concerned, because he has to be judged.
For younger viewers, an LP is what you now call a music download from Spotify or somewhere else.
I tend to forget I'm quite old.
The American gentleman in the middle row.
Hey there, everyone. Kevin Accendine, failed comedian, dual citizen to the United States.
You could end up the president of the Ukraine.
I could. Just wait. Yeah, as far as a politically dense person who has too much going on in their working life to focus on the news daily and keep tabs on everybody's career, Trump is an obvious charlatan to me, a criminal from the beginning. His practices in the 80s with construction companies and non-payments. Right now in Scotland, he's refusing to pay court fees, for being taken to court over his assumption that there shouldn't be windmills visible from his silly golf course. I don't understand where these things are going. The politics that people don't agree with is one thing, but he's an obvious criminal, and he doesn't.
Yeah, though he's not the first of those, is he, to hold office in the United States?
He is not, but he seems like he might be the most destructive because he doesn't
Well, you see,
seem...
I want to challenge that. Will you forgive me?
Sure.
You see, Barack Obama inherited 2 wars and made it 8 wars. If Hillary Clinton had beaten Trump, those 8 wars would have been doubled down on. Actually, Trump has started no wars and has arguably, I don't even think it's much of an argument, created the basis of a lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula and begun withdrawing forces from Afghanistan and actually withdrawn forces from Syria. Now, these are bigger crimes than not paying your electricity bill in Scotland.
Well, that's a far stretch for not paying electricity bills.
You see my point? Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson killed 4 million people, including dropping an ocean of chemical weapons on them in Indochina. But you don't seem to see that in the same vein as a guy who was a rogue landlord in the 80s in New York. I'm questioning your perspective here.
Well, again, I also voted for Bernie Sanders, and it would have been a different world if he had been president. And so it's just difficult to watch what is the ultimate agenda for someone that is out for just making money. He appears to be somebody that didn't anticipate being president, and now that he's well in there...
Imagine an American politician who's just out to make money. Let me say, as I said at the time, I'm not happy that Donald Trump is president of the United States, but I'm extremely happy Hillary Clinton isn't.
I agree with that as well.
Excellent. The lady there in the middle row.
Claudia, Bryan, London consultants. I think that he won't be impeached, Donald Trump. I also believe that he will beat everybody. I'm going to tell you why. You may say he's a madman when he tweets at early hours of the morning. That's early hours London time, I might add. And also, I don't think Melania should take his phone away because he's actually gained a huge voter base by these tweets. I speak to people on a constant basis that are actually not amused by his tweets. They're empowered by his tweets. That's something that you need to think about and watch.
But what about when he says, I'm a strong and stable genius, and in my unmatched, what was the latest one? in my unmatched wisdom. I mean,
He has
this
great
is vainglorious
confidence in
nonsense.
himself. He is a confident man. He has great confidence in himself. But I will say that he is gaining a lot of support from people 5 years ago that did not support him. They now speak very highly of him. And it is by the mad tweets because they feel that he has a lot of courage. And again, as to reiterate what you'd said earlier, George, he hasn't started any wars. So he is looking quite good at the moment. He is brokering peace around the world. So I do think that the madman act is just merely an act.
Well, that is interesting. He's certainly he's a different man, in my opinion, on the platform at these massive rallies. He's quite an effective mass orator, actually. His tweets, I still believe, are completely unhinged most of the time. I can't believe that a grown man, never mind the President of the United States, actually wrote those words. I mean, he threatened Turkey the other day with the absolute devastation and destruction of their economy. Well, of course, many presidents of the United States have visited such destruction on others, but they don't usually put it in writing before they've done so. But he's more effective in longer statements and speeches than he is in the short form, in my view. Anyway, thank you for that. Gentleman behind you.
Yes, Joshua from South London. Yes, I think this transposition, if you like to call it, of left and right that you identified earlier on, is quite evident on both sides of the Atlantic.
It is,
and if we've got enough time, I'd like to list them all.
Yeah, go.
With a little bit of detail. Okay, on my way to Ukraine, guess what? Yeah, Ukraine. I happened upon an American tourist, okay? And yes, I brought up politics. Shouldn't have, but there you go. You know, what's done is done. Now, we of course, not too surprisingly, got on the subject of Trump. And of course, he was very anti-Trump because he's a supposedly because he's a well-travelled man. He's got quite a world view. He's not your typical Trump supporter and is consequently not a Trump supporter. But when I identified Hillary Clinton's support for the Iraq war, even though he's supposedly more left-wing than a Trump supporter, in theory, he condoned it. He said, it was unpatriotic not to support it, which is not only a very tragic irony, but is just the worst case of sort of, if you like, naivety that I've heard from anybody, any American. I'm not trying to generalise any nationality, of course, but that was very, very poor naivety on his part. Now, the second example comes from a citizen of the UK, my own uncle, in fact, whose residence I was at a couple of weeks ago. Lifelong Labour supporter. Okay, he wouldn't vote Tory if his existence depended upon it. But when I indicated to him that Hillary Clinton oversaw the destruction of Libya and that she, again supported the Iraq war, when I use those examples, he just said, and I can't believe I heard these words come out of his mouth, that doesn't necessarily make her a worse person than Donald J. Trump. Again, very, very deplorable naivety and, if you like, dismissiveness.
Well, it's perspective, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit, if you forgive me, like my conversation with our American guest. Someone who's rude and vulgar and ugly and florid and fat and has a track record of venal behaviour towards women is judged in one way. Somebody who's uber cool and smooth and immaculately tailored and can sing Sam Cooke is forgiven for bombing 8 countries and killing thousands of people, including American citizens. Isn't it this question of perspective here?
Well, very much so. Very much so. I mean, and again, another example is when I use that example to another person who identifies as left-wing, in supposedly more than just name. But veering off the subject a little bit, when we came to the EU, because I disagreed with him about the nature of the EU and why we should have left. When I used the example of overturning Greece's democratic referendum against the austerity package that was coercively forced upon it, he just, again, overlooked that. He said, well, there was no other solution, so it's okay, even though that's as right-wing as you can basically get. overturning the decision of the democratic will of people and imposing
Yeah.
what amounted to almost economic sanctions on them.
Remarkable how many left-wing people are content with that. Joshua, just running out of time. Patrick, are they serious, the Democrats, or is this just showtime to kind of ink or pencil in the word I, the letter I, on the forehead of Donald Trump? Or are they really going to go for it?
I think they have no choice but to go for it. And I think the seeds of the failure of the Democrats were sown a long time ago. You can't escape the past. If you go to the Donald Trump rallies, you speak to some of these people on the fringe, ex-Democrats, Reagan Democrats, if you will, the one thing they'll say is, yes, I know he's completely bombastic, he does horrible things, but he says what he means. He seems to speak the truth, and this is why they're supporting him. The opposition's reaction is always hysterical. So now Trump can stand there and say, look at the other side, they're radical, their policies are off the hook, there's absolutely no way that this is going to work in America, and so he can sort of create distance between himself and the opposition. It's a vicious spiral that's not going to end. And like Adam said, being able to play this Tammany Hall-style boxing match and hit your opponent all the way across the ring, this seems to resonate with quite a few people right now at this point in history. But the last thing I'll say is, blue Democrats, the one thing that they voted for Ronald Reagan in the second term was absolutely on the economy. And if you look at American elections, and to my colleague here said this earlier, the 401k, the stock market driven fixed income retirements, that generates votes. That translates into votes in a general election. For a re-election, if the stock market's up, he's going to get those available votes from moderate Democrats. Absolutely, 100%, because I've spoke to many of them already this year, and they're sheepishly, quietly saying they're probably going to vote for Trump.
Adrian, how does it all look to you, my friend?
Yes, well, I'm glad that you've left me to near the end.
We always save the best till then.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about why Donald Trump is attempting to be impeached by the Democrats. I think it's a lot to do with power and how that power is financed. Because with the Republicans in the United States, money is like raised in conventions with, donors donating to the party. In Donald Trump's case, he had his own money, and he's still looking for more money to...
I don't think he spent any of his own money, actually.
Well, he has, but he's still looking to raise more money. However, with the Democrats, they have a central fund, and that central fund stems from the Clinton Foundation, and there's also like an Obama Foundation being formed as we speak.
I'm sure.
And these two financial bases finance the two polarized political views. And you can see allies to these two political views in Russia being more Trumpish, North Korea, Trumpish, and the European Union being more Democrat. The United States at the moment is being more Democrat, despite having like a Republican president. And I believe that Hillary Clinton never dreamt in her wildest dreams that Donald Trump would beat her in the 2016 election, because I think that the Secret Services were very busy in the background manipulating the count. But I think the swing to Trump was so huge, she lost. And she doesn't believe it and doesn't accept it. And that's really what's behind it. It's anger that she can lose based upon something that wasn't planned. And that planning has gone long into the future. It started a long, long time ago. They envisioned a democratic government on the left side of politics for a very long time. And Donald Trump is a big hiccup in their system. And they're trying their hardest to resolve this. Now, where is the Democrats' money going to be coming from in the future? What seems to have escaped many people's notice is that in Ukraine, they have the second largest oil and gas reserves, shale oil and gas reserves in the world. And those shale and oil gas reserves are being exploited by Burisma, that company that Joe Biden's son is seconded onto. I can't imagine that he would be...
He's a well-known shale oil expert.
Yes, yes. And the reason it's so important is because in the last 5 and 10 years, the extraction of shale oil has become so economically viable, it will be the biggest form of income that the world has ever seen. It's going to be more than cars, more than gold, more than anything, because it takes only a small amount of money to just shoot a bit of water into the crust of the earth to release shale gas. And this gas comes out, and it's virtually tax-free to most people that are in the Democrat Party for one reason or another. In the Ukraine, for instance, they preside over this huge shale gas reserve, and Russia are fully aware of that. And also, a quarter of that reserve is in Russian-controlled sectors. And I think that the whole thing is being set up for a big world war starting in Ukraine, because I think that President Putin is fully aware of all this. The Ukrainians are fully aware of it, and that's why they are desperately trying to side with the United States of America, because they don't want to be overrun by Russia, and they could be. The investigation into corruption in Ukraine was stopped by Joe Biden, who threatened to withhold $1 billion worth of help.
It's on video.
Yeah.
Can't even be denied.
Yes, unless the lawyer that was investigating was sacked, and he was, promptly. So we're looking at the reasons for impeachment, and these are huge reasons to get rid of a Republican president who just wants justice for people around the world, and obviously justice for his own people. And being a nationalist, of course, this is directly opposite in policy to what the Democrats are trying to do at the moment. The Democrats are trying to knock down walls, and President Trump is trying to build walls to keep the nation together in the United States, and similarly throughout the world. So the reasons for impeachment are much more than political. They're economic.
Very interesting. Adam, leaving aside that rather rose-tinted version of Donald Trump's mission, at least from my point of view, I'm not sure he's building a wall to keep the nation together. I don't think he's interested at all in keeping the nation together. He's a divisive politician, deliberately divisive. He just hopes that there'll be more on his side of the division than on the other. You have told me before that you believe that Trump will comfortably be re-elected. Are you still of that view?
Oh, more than ever before. The danger for Trump was always that he couldn't paint himself as the perennial victim of the establishment. And the worst thing for him would be to appear before his base as sort of establishment light, establishment junior, establishment good intentions, but nevertheless the road to hell. This has been absolutely brilliant for him. And there are some politicians, in fact, throughout the history of the world, some of the most successful political leaders have been those who have courted adversarial circumstances in order to fight it. The ones who had the big ideas and implemented them peacefully aren't like that. One of my heroes, Deng Xiaoping, is the opposite of that. He needed calm, he needed harmony in order to change China for the better and lift more people out of poverty in the shortest period of time than has ever happened before in human history. But then there are other people, a kind of Alexander the Great person who, without an opponent, who is Alexander? water. Without the swamp to drain, who is Trump, the great swamp drainer? And because this swamp has become so energized and so unhinged, I mean, come on, Alexandria Cortez as the face of the Democratic Party. I mean, it's lunacy. They've gone off the rails on the crazy train. But this plays into Trump's hands. It plays into his base. And I think irrespective of who the Democrats choose, and it will probably be Warren, which is like Hillary Clinton without the feminine charm, he's going to not only win big, but I think he's going to win huge.
Andre, last word to you from the Breitbart circles. Are you confident that Trump will A, not be impeached and B, re-elected?
Well, impeach effectively means indict, so I don't have an argument against potentially being passed by the Congress. It won't go through Senate, so he won't be convicted of the impeachment. Look, I think he's going to win, and I'll tell you why, because he's one of the few politicians that we've ever come across who actually gets into trouble for doing what he told you he intended to do. People are going absolutely crazy about this situation with the Kurds. He said he was going to pull American forces out of absolutely everywhere, and that's precisely what happened. But
not really, because he sent the same number of forces to Saudi Arabia. Well, overnight.
It's a direction of travel,
to defend the head choppers.
Hey, look, as you said, it's gone down from three. What was it? 8 wars to nil. No, that's not a bad effort. But look, I will make one important point that people forget. People think that Saint Barack is this marvellous person. Look, as far as I'm concerned, the hatred in politics did not start with Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders should have beat Hillary Clinton. In fact, he probably did. What happened was a series of rigged votes, a series of games being played, an absolutely disgraceful primary system. And then you have people like Barack Obama comes in, every single conservative organisation in America, even the voluntary ones, get investigated by the tax man, just a mass demand by Barack Obama. And so just because we hear Donald Trump shouting a little bit, we forget there's some real nasty people in the Democratic Party, and Hillary is top of that list.
Well, there you are. Lock them up is not a good slogan in politics. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television. You have been a wonderful audience. Thanks for watching.